Well, today begins a new chapter. In the Ministry of Seed of Abraham Torah classes, we begin the study of the book of Joshua. Joshua is a natural continuation of the Torah from a historical aspect, as the final words of Deuteronomy record the death of Moses and the handing off of Israel's human leadership to Joshua, son of Nun. But the book of Joshua is also a natural continuation of the theological and of the spiritual essence of the first 5 books of Moses, the Torah. Because we see that what was established, what was ordained by the Lord through Moses, now begins to come to fruition. And the immediate fruition was the settling of God's people in the land of Canaan. Now, because we spent 5 years studying the 5 books of Moses together, it seems right to me that we need to spend a couple of sessions preparing to transition out of the Torah into the book of Joshua, the first of that section of the Bible that the Jews call the former prophets. And studying the Torah in the manner that we have can at times cause us not to see the forest because of the trees. We can miss the big picture and miss this beautiful flow of the Bible's progressive revelation if we don't pause to catch our breath. So let's climb into the gondola of a heavenly balloon. Let's float up for a while high above the wondrous work that Jehovah has created and established so that we can view it in a panorama as a whole. Now, I've mentioned before that in one sense, the entire Tanakh, the Old Testament, is the history of Israel. Why Israel is created, who created it, what's its immediate purpose, what the ultimate purpose of Israel would be. This is the skeleton to which the flesh of the entire Bible clings. Now, without our understanding of the Israelite skeleton as the framework and foundation of our faith in Yeshua, the soft and malleable flesh, all too malleable flesh, of the New Testament can take on practically any form. Indeed, it has. Thus, we see literally thousands of Christian denominations established, each with its own set of faith doctrines, each certain that it has become the exclusive standard bearer of God's truth to the exclusion of all the others. I'm so grateful that the Lord is finally starting to open the eyes of his beloved church that Israel is not some obsolete dispensation that has been replaced by a group of faithful Gentiles. Rather, Israel in its history embodies and exemplifies God's ideal divine principles, its values, its justice system. It's those principles, those values, that justice system that produced our Messiah, Yeshua, who has fulfilled them in a way that has brought about the possibility of redemption for mankind and for peace with God. Now, I marvel at how fortunate of a generation we are to be eyewitnesses to the fulfillment of prophecies that were foretold thousands of years ago. It's just a historical fact that the fulfillment of Bible prophecy ceased upon the destruction of the temple by the Roman legions in 70 AD. It did not begin again until the mid-1940s of our modern era. During that entire almost 1900-year period of time that started not long after Christ's death, there was an extended period of prophetic dormancy. And it was that long dormancy that caused many Christians to lose faith and to begin to interpret prophecies allegorically in ways that have led to all sorts of fanciful and erroneous doctrines that are now deeply embedded in Christianity, the worst among them being replacement theology. But we are living during that era that the prophetic dominoes are falling once again. And they are falling at a breathtaking rate. Now, although just as the Israelites were blind to the prophetic fulfillment of the arrival of their Savior 2,000 years ago, so is the 21st century church often blind to prophetic fulfillments that are happening right before our eyes. And the first prophetic action that marked the awakening from its long slumber was the reestablishment of Israel as a Jewish nation in its original and ancient homeland in 1948. Israel has always been and will be until the establishment of the millennial kingdom, that is the early reign of Christ after he returns, the place and the people where the Lord's prophecies are pronounced and through whom the prophecies come about. Without the existence of Israel, prophecy simply doesn't happen. So rather than begin our preparation for Joshua by starting at Genesis 1:1 and the creation story, we're going to begin a little bit later in the book of Genesis with the prehistory of Israel. This review is going to be fast-moving, but also in a different style than the manner in which we have studied the Torah. It's going to be general in nature. It's going to be presented more like the telling of an epic story. So sit back and relax, but have your Bibles handy as we remember where Israel came from in preparation for our study of the books of Joshua and then Judges. Well, Abraham is without doubt the best place to start, because it was with him that God made an irrevocable covenant out of which the Hebrew people and the path of mankind's redemption would ultimately come. It surprises many Christians today that the gospel is really first spoken of as an act of Abraham in Genesis 15:6. Because there it says, "And Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness." Now, although Jews correctly consider him their forefather, you will hear modern Jews say he was the first Jew, or he was the first Israelite. Well, since the term Israelite couldn't even have happened until God changed Abraham's grandson's name from Jacob to Israel, and since the term Jew began with the tribe of Judah, which was one of Israel's 12 sons, it'd be misleading to apply either the term Jew or Israelite to Abraham, except maybe in a poetic sense. Now, Abraham was born sometime around 2000 BC, 4,000 years ago, in an area historically known as the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent was called that because it lies in the floodplain between and along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where regular flooding deposited rich silt. It was ideal for agricultural use. He lived at least for a time in the city-state of Ur. It was in a region at that time that was called Mesopotamia. Now today, Ur, a great deal of Mesopotamia, falls within Iraq's borders, next to the Euphrates River. Ur was the center of moon god worship, and much of that ancient city has been excavated, and there's no doubt as to its identity. Well, Abraham's father was TORAH, a descendant of Shem, who was one of Noah's sons. Only about 350 years had passed since Noah and his family escaped that world-destroying deluge of water by constructing an ark. It's an enormous wooden ship that Noah built at God's command. So if you were alive in 2000 BC, you could have asked, think about this, you could have asked Noah himself about the great flood because he was still living when Abraham was born. Well, about 200 years ago, there was a scholar who invented a name for the countless descendants of Noah's son, Shem. The scholar called them Shemites. Guess what we call them today? Semites. The name stuck. So genealogically speaking, Abraham was a Semite since he descended from Shem, although he belonged to a culture that was very probably Amorite, a people who became the epitome of evil, ironically, one that God set about to eradicate. Now, being a Semite identifies Abraham or anybody else not to a geographic region or to a particular culture, but to a very large extended family that came from a specific gene pool. Now, unfortunately, we most often hear of the term Semite today used in the phrase anti-Semitic, all right, having come to denote some type of predisposition or bigotry against the Jewish people. Now, during Abraham's era, about 4,000 years ago, civilization was in full swing, but it manifested itself quite differently from region to region to region and continent to continent. In Asia and Middle East, the area where the Bible primarily concerns itself, there were hundreds of tribes and clans that were nomadic to some degree. And where cities formed, they were what's called city-states. They were just small little nations or kingdoms with some defined territory that was quite limited. It usually didn't go much beyond the city walls. Now, typically, every little city-state had its own king. Most often, it even had its own set of gods. There were constant skirmishes between these small city-states. Some of them were very serious, some amounted to very little, usually involving stealing each other's possessions. And those possessions, the most valued of them usually included livestock, their god idols, food, pasture land. Sometimes they took people for slaves and for servants. Well, the taking of people from another tribe or a nation was a very common way for kings and tribal leaders to more rapidly grow their own population, thereby increasing their personal security and wealth and power and status. Now, some ancient cultures were tent dwellers. That meant they were wanderers, that they constantly moved from area to area to fresh pasture lands and find new water for their flocks and herds. Now, there were others called semi-nomadic. They tended to stay in an area a little bit longer than the nomadic tent dwellers. So they lived in non-portable huts constructed of the local flora and fauna. Then there were what sociologists call sedentary peoples, meaning they lived permanently in cities with governments, taxes. Yes, they had taxes in 2000 BC. Mud, brick, and stone houses, magnificent palaces and temples. They even had roads, sanitation systems. Now, most often, these several types of cultures lived side by side. They were kind of symbiotic. The wanderers, the sedentary. There were even small empires by that time. As with the early Babylonian Empire, that is unrelated and unconnected to the later Babylonian Empire, the one that conquered Judah and sent them into exile. They're completely unrelated. But, of course, that one came 1,000 years after what's called the old Babylonian Empire collapsed. Well, in Abraham's time, it was only about 200 years that had passed since the Tower of Babel episode, when God scrambled a single human language into many so that humans would disperse over the planet and repopulate other geographical areas. All but a handful of the millions of descendants of Noah had by now turned their backs on God. Idolatry was rampant. Sex was perverse. It had become part of religious ceremony. Child sacrifice was fairly widespread. In quick fashion, since the destruction of the Great Flood, the world was once again thoroughly wicked. Didn't take long. There were many relatively new spoken and written languages with extensive, elegant vocabularies, even alphabets. Nimrod was the best-known leader of a widespread revolt against God that resulted in the construction of the Tower of Babel. Nimrod is rightly credited with being the founder of what the Bible calls the Mystery Babylon religions. He built the first walled city after the flood. He's credited with modernizing the art of warfare. See, Nimrod was of the line of Ham, who was a son of Noah. Ham represents a line of people that began their wickedness with just a few years of stepping out of that ark. In fact, Nimrod was the son of Cush, the line who populated much of Africa. It might surprise you to know that the great Nimrod was a black man, and several ancient carvings bear that fact out. Nimrod married a woman named Semiramis. After he died, Semiramis deified him and declared him to be the sun god. She herself was worshipped as the queen of heaven. She was also known as the mother of Tammuz, who would have been seen as the reincarnation of Nimrod. Now, this triumvirate of sun god, father, queen of heaven, mother, and reincarnated son, this would become the formula for nearly all the Mystery Babylon religions. That is, the pagan religions of the world, and that includes right up till today. We find all throughout history, in all cultures, transliterated names and titles of Nimrod and Semiramis assigned to their own particular pantheon of gods. For instance, in Egypt, the queen of heaven is called Isis. In India, Indrani. In Asia, Sybil. In the ancient Middle Eastern lands, Ashtaroth. We see her mentioned in several places in the Old Testament. As for Nimrod, he is also called Baal and known as the god-man Ninus, the builder of Nineveh. His son Tammuz, the reincarnation of Nimrod, so Tammuz is also Nimrod. Well, hundreds of subcultures had erupted. Communication was well developed. Clay tablets were being utilized as the primary writing medium for cuneiform in Mesopotamia. While a long way southwest on the African continent, at the mouth of the Nile, the Egyptians were using papyrus and reed stylus to write their hieroglyphics, even building libraries because the volume of records was growing so fast. Trade routes were already open from the Middle East to the Far East to India, even to China. The Mediterranean was a superhighway of shipping. It connected all these nations that surrounded it. These regions and nations were, of course, not unknown to each other. Trade was occurring amongst them. Stone was still the primary material for tools and weapons. Copper was in widespread use. Bronze was known. Iron would soon be discovered. Egypt was already at Abraham's time dotted with pyramids. In fact, by the time Abraham was born, the pyramid building era was over. There had been no pyramids built since before Abraham was born. This was not a world of disinterested, small-thinking, primitive people. They were smart. They were aggressive. They were forward-thinking. They were constantly seeking to improve their technology and the quality of their lives. It was during this same time, a lot further west, over by the Atlantic Ocean, that an unknown people constructed a very strange structure that scientists still puzzle over to this day. It's called Stonehenge. Now, Abraham, no doubt, started life as a pagan. His father, TORAH, was a merchant of idols, standard idols of all the various Mystery Babylon religions. It's likely, therefore, that Abraham owned and worshipped a number of these gods himself. On the other hand, he could have been one of the few that still believed in the one God that Noah spoke about, but that's pretty unlikely. Certainly, if Abraham had despised idols, it's not easy to imagine his getting along very well with his father, who would have taught him otherwise. It's also probable that Abraham worshipped God Almighty as well as some number of other gods. It's hard to know. The spiritual minds of the people of that day had no problem with the idea of worshiping many gods, adding a new one if he or she happened along. And people of Abraham's day also tended to put their gods in a hierarchy, with one of them being dominant and then the rest of them following in a kind of celestial pecking order. Now, one of the great curiosities of history is that it appears that atheism, the belief that there is no God, there is no spiritual world, and that there's nothing greater than mankind, is a relatively modern concept. Every ancient society ever discovered is found to have worshipped superior beings. Well, Abraham had two brothers, a very small family for his day. One of them died, and Abraham married Sarah, who was his half-sister, and she was unable to give him children. Now, marrying close family members was the norm for that day, and it wasn't forbidden by God. Now, for reasons we're not given, Abraham's father, TORAH, gathers his family together, and he leaves the comforts and the security of city life in Ur. He travels north and west around 600 miles till they arrive at a place called Haran. Why they stopped there, we don't know, because the clearly stated original destination in the Bible was a place called Canaan, about 400 miles to the south. In any case, the family decided to actually settle in Haran. Now, what Abraham did for a living is anybody's guess, although Genesis tells us that when he moved, he took flocks and herds with him, so he was prosperous. Now, one day, when Abraham was around 75 years old, God revealed himself to him. And the way the scriptures seem to flavor it, it's not a first-time introduction. God tells Abraham to leave Haran, but he doesn't tell him where he's going to go. That probably has something to do with his aged father and their surviving brother deciding to stay put. God strikes a covenant, a unilateral contract with Abraham that if he will follow him, God will give him a land of his own. He'll bring forth a great nation from his seed, and from this the whole world will be blessed. Now, there's practically no information at all about Abraham prior to this time. All things considered, he was probably a pretty ordinary person. Surprised as anybody at this God choosing him to carry out such a grand plan. Now, I've often wondered how God first gained Abraham's attention. Suspect by speaking to him, at least that's the way the Bible presents it. But as an Amorite, Abraham was surrounded by idols and gods. It's unlikely any of those pieces of wood or stone had much to say to him. So whatever it was that however God communicated with him, it was pretty spectacular, and it was believable enough that Abraham did what he was told. Now, Abraham took his wife, Sarai, she was called at that time, and Lot in Hebrew, it was his nephew, by the way, that was the son of the deceased brother. took a few servants, probably a number of cousins, and they struck out for parts unknown. Apparently taking a cue from his father's intended original destination, he wandered into Canaan, stopping at the site of Shechem. Now, Canaan was not a country. It was not a nation. It's just a named region. And the term Canaan was used then in the same way we use the term today, Middle East. There's no nation called the Middle East. It's just a generalized geographical area that's been given a title. Now, the widely scattered inhabitants of Canaan, of course, were called Canaanites. And although there were ancient family ties between all these residents of the various cities, states, and villages throughout Canaan, they were not a homogeneous people. Speaking of them, Canaanites is roughly analogous to our speaking of the inhabitants of the Middle East as Arabs. In reality, the so-called Arabs of the Middle East see themselves based on national identities, like Iraqis, Iranians, Egyptians, Syrians, so on and so forth. So much of the Canaanites would identify themselves more in relation to their city-state or their king or their village to which they were attached. And they would not even have all even been descended from Canaan. This is much like our modern use of the term Arabs, where many of these people that we call Arabs today have no Arab background at all and don't even speak Arabic. But nonetheless, they're just kind of all lumped together as Arabs from our Western perspective. Now, it's important to understand how the land of Canaan even originally came about. A few hundred years prior to Abraham's birth, Noah had occasion to be humiliated by his son Ham, of whom Nimrod was the descendant. Ham had wandered uninvited into his father's tent, to Noah's tent, found him asleep, drunk, and naked. And Ham went out from the tent and he informed his two brothers, Shem and Japheth, who promptly covered up their father's nakedness, making sure that they didn't look upon him. Well, when Noah awoke and found a cloak over him, he was incensed. He asked what happened, and his sons informed him, and the irate Noah responded by issuing a curse upon one of Ham's sons, Canaan. The exact nature of the offense is unclear, and lots of speculation about it. And why the grandson of Noah, Canaan, took the brunt of Noah's anger, we're also left to ponder. We don't know. As with many biblical curses and blessings, the one Noah pronounced on Canaan was prophetic. Some years after the incident, Ham's son Canaan left home and moved to a region far to the south that eventually came to be known after his name, the land of Canaan. Now, over the centuries, the descendants of Noah's other two brothers, or rather two sons, Japheth and Shem, they remained generally friendly. They on favorable terms with one another, but the descendants of Noah's third son, Ham, through the specific line of Ham's son Canaan, became rivals, at times even enemies of the descendants of Japheth and Shem. Now, many of the sons that Canaan spawned eventually spread out over the area. They grew, they divided again, became their own tribes, and reestablished their own city-states and their own villages. In time, they even warred with one another. Some 1,000 years later, we find these descendants of Canaan who had stayed in the land fighting to keep Moses and the Israelites out. Tribes from other areas moved in and settled in the region. Jebusites, Girgashites, Hittites, Hivites, even the tribe Abraham originally belonged to, the Amorites, they all came. They all eventually became enemies of Israel. Now, if Abraham, who it is confirmed in the Bible, is a descendant of Shem, was indeed, he was an Amorite, a tribe originating from Ham, then it must have been through intermarriage. Perhaps simply he joined the Amorite tribe by a statement of allegiance. All this is very customary for that era. Because by the time of the birth of Abraham, centuries had passed since the origination of the Amorite tribe, and as it happened with many other tribes, the Amorites had grown, they'd splintered off into factions. Some faction members had moved to other areas, became sub-tribes in other regions. A lot of movement, a lot of growth. Well, the location inside the land of Canaan that Abraham first stopped was a place called Shechem. Now, today Shechem is known as the Arab city of Nablus, located in what's called the West Bank of Israel. And there at Shechem, God made his plan clear to Abraham. As written in Genesis 12:7, God said that this was the land. Let me say it again, it's important. He did this at Shechem. At Shechem, God said, this is the land I'm going to give you for you and for your descendants. So Abraham built an altar there, presumably made an animal sacrifice, and after a short stay, he moved on eventually all the way south to Egypt because a severe famine had come upon the area of Canaan. And after a run-in with Egypt's Pharaoh, in which Abraham gave up his wife Sarai to the Pharaoh momentarily, apparently to avoid some kind of a dangerous confrontation, the famine ended. Abraham took Sarah and his family back to Canaan. Now, Abraham arrived back in Canaan a much wealthier man than when he left it, because the Pharaoh thought Abraham's God was a threat to him. So he gave Abraham a lot of valuable gifts so that he might leave without incurring his God's wrath. Now, though Abraham now had a lot of silver and gold, the family's real wealth was their flocks and herds. And about this same time, far to the north in Mesopotamia, which was Abraham's birthplace, thousands mourned the death of Noah. Same Noah of Noah's Ark. He died at over 900 years of age. Well, Canaan was a really tough place to live. Totally unlike the more dependable Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, where Abraham came from. Famines were a part of life in Canaan. Everything was based on the soil. Everything was based on the fickle rains. No rain, no crops, no pasture land, no survival. Which would explain why the Canaanites might have held the world record for the number of gods they had. A god for the rain, a god for wind, a god for clouds, a god for barley, you name it, they had a god for it. But their chief god was Baal, but at least he was the most popular. Now, despite the difficult living conditions, apparently Abraham and his nephew Lot prospered. They had so much so that they actually had to part company because their herds and their flocks were growing big enough to outstrip the land that they mutually occupied, and it caused a lot of disputes among the herdsmen. Now, Lot must have liked the city life because guess where he moved? Sodom, of Sodom and Gomorrah fame. He moved to Sodom, somewhere near the southwestern bank of the Dead Sea. Now, a little bit of time later, without warning, peaceful old Abraham, and he's getting old now, finds himself having to be a warrior leader. Seems some kings, that meaning rulers from several city-states, from a region east and north of Canaan, decided to invade 5 Canaanite kings in the area where Abraham lived. And in the process, these invading kings sacked the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and it made Lot one of their prisoners. And family being what it is, Abraham recruited 318 men, and off they go to chase down these kings of the east and try to rescue Lot. Well, a few miles north of Damascus, Damascus, Syria, they catch up to these raiders, they defeat them, they free Lot, and they reclaim a lot of the stolen booty. Abraham returns to the cheers of the people, the gratitude of these Canaanite kings who had their stuff taken. Well, he is also honored by this mysterious king and high priest of the city of Shalem. Centuries later, the city is going to be called Jerusalem. The man's name was Melchizedek. Now, it's a Hebrew tradition that Melchizedek was none other than Shem, son of Noah. That's entirely feasible, but it's not certain. Melchizedek, you see, is not really a name, it's a title. In Hebrew, the title means king of righteousness. Isn't that cool? And though Shem would have been hundreds of years old by that time, the table of generations in the Bible indicates that Shem was indeed alive when Abraham was living in Canaan. Making Melchizedek to actually be Shem answers a lot of questions about this strange, obscure, interesting Bible character who later will be compared in some ways to Christ. Well, we arrive now at an important point in the Bible. The first known use of the word Hebrew is presented to us, and it's ascribed to Abraham. Now, no other ancient sources uses the word Hebrew as a title of a specific people group prior to this usage in Genesis. There's a lot of conjecture as to the word's origination and even its meaning. Some scholars think it identifies a whole new culture with Abraham as its founder. Others believe it's a term that represents a new religion, perhaps the first monotheistic religion. Another line of thinking is that the word Hebrew is a perversion of the Sumerian word hapiru, which when spoken in ancient Semitic sounds almost identical to the word iparu, which means wanderers or outcasts, people that have no particular ethnic or regional ties. Modern Hebrew scholars almost unanimously say the word Hebrew means one who crossed over, likely referring to Abraham crossing over the Euphrates River in order to journey south to Canaan. Now, the issue of the origination of the word Hebrew revolves around whether the term as originally used was religious, or was it racial, or was it cultural, or was it just descriptive? Regardless of its etymology, Judaism and Christianity see Hebrew, the word Hebrew, as a term describing the biblical ancestral line of the promises made within the covenant that God gave to Abraham, and that Abraham ratified by leaving Mesopotamia and moving south to Canaan in search of the land God promised him would be his. Therefore, the Hebrew line begins with Abraham as its founder. From Abraham on to his son Isaac, and from Isaac's son to Jacob. Eventually, by the way, of course, Jacob was renamed what? Israel. And then finally to the 12 tribes of Israel, which includes the Jews as we know them today. All are included under the title of Hebrew, although in modern terms, the term Hebrew just is out of use, particularly in Israel. Well, now back in Canaan, after a short stay in Egypt, Abraham, having so long lived a nomadic lifestyle, again in the cyclical need for new pasture lands for his flocks and herds, he moves on. This time, he and his clan backtrack, and they settle at the desert oasis known as Beersheba. Now, Sarai, his wife, still hasn't given Abraham a child. They have both pretty much given up hope, even though implicit in God's promise to make them into a great nation is what? Children. Now, Sarai, very old, beyond childbearing years, gives her maidservant, Hagar, to Abraham to bear him a child in her stead. This was completely normal customary for 2000 BC. Jewish tradition says Hagar was an Egyptian, possibly even a daughter of Pharaoh, acquired during Abraham's stay in Egypt. Very possibly, Hagar was one of the gifts that Pharaoh gave to Abraham as a peace offering, in a kind of a customary way even, to create an alliance. Well, Hagar becomes pregnant. Sarai becomes greatly jealous. She treats Hagar so terribly she runs away. God finds Hagar, convinces her to go back, promises her a boy child, promises her a son. She returns. She gives birth to Ishmael. Now, before Hagar becomes pregnant, God formalizes his covenant with Abraham. In typical Middle Eastern fashion, an animal is sacrificed. It's cut up into pieces, and then the pieces are divided into two piles. And then the agreeing parties walk between these two piles as an indication of their acceptance of the terms. However, we're told that only, very interesting, only God walked through the pieces of the animal. Now, this is an important detail because it indicates the covenant that has been made between God and Abraham is unilateral. This means that Abraham had no duties. Whatever was to happen was God's responsibility. The terms of the covenant would be carried out by God regardless of what Abraham or his descendants did. That's why this covenant is often referred to as the promise. God promised things to Abraham, but Abraham made no promises to God. Well, it's at this point that God gives Abraham the rites of male circumcision as the sign and the seal of his everlasting covenant with the Hebrew people. It is observed to this day. Male circumcision was not uncommon in those times, but it was not known to have been associated with a covenant until this incident. A few years later, Abraham's elderly wife, Sarai, shocks everybody by becoming pregnant at the age of 90 and gives birth to Isaac. And although people at that time did live longer than we do now, Sarah was way beyond childbearing age. Rather than now feeling satisfied, however, Sarah doesn't like the competition with having Hagar around. So she throws a fit. And she demands that Abraham disown Hagar and that child of hers, Ishmael, now 13 years old. Abraham complies. Hagar and Ishmael are thrown out of the camp. Out in the desert and near death, mother and child are rescued by God, who tells Hagar that Ishmael will father a great nation and he will produce 12 princes. Ishmael will go on to become the forefather of the Arab races. And he is often erroneously referred to by Muslims as the father of Islam. That is false. The dispute that began over Ishmael and Isaac, brought about by Abraham's and Sarah's disbelief and their impatience, is being played out before our eyes every day in the never-ending Middle Eastern conflicts. Talk about a slippery slope. It's most important that we pause here and examine for a moment a very key element of God's plan as outlined in Genesis, one that is apparently misunderstood even today by many in the Christian church. And that most important element answers this question. Just exactly which of Abraham's descendants would be used to bring about the promises contained in the covenant made by God with Abraham? Which? Which family line from Abraham does the covenant apply to? Islam claims that God is going to bring about whatever his plans are for the world through Abraham's son, Ishmael and Ishmael's descendants. Jews and Christians claim that God's divine plans will be carried out through the descendants of Abraham's son Isaac. Put into contemporary terms, which group is God's chosen people? The Hebrews from Isaac or the Arab Muslims from Ishmael? This is a rather distinct fork in the road, and it can't be bypassed. One direction is correct. The other direction is not correct. No amount of religious or political tolerance can bring about a compromise on this issue. The answer to this most fundamental question is found in your Bibles. Turn your Bibles to Genesis 17. Genesis 17. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, you can turn to page 15. Genesis chapter 17. We're going to read from verses 15 through 22. God said to Abraham, "As for Sarai, your wife, you are not to call her Sarai. Her name is to be Sarah. I will bless her. Moreover, I will give you a son by her. Truly, I will bless her. She will be a mother of nations. Kings of people will come from her." At this, Abraham fell on his face and he laughed. And he thought to himself, will a child be born to a man of 100 years old? Will Sarah give birth at 90? Abraham said to God, "If only Ishmael could live in your presence." God answered, "No. Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son, and you are to call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. But as for Ishmael, I have heard you. I have blessed him. I will make him fruitful. I'll give him many descendants. He will father 12 princes. I'll make him a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this time next year." And with that, God finished speaking with Abraham and went up from him. Any questions? It's several years after Ishmael has been born. Abraham is well satisfied. He has his son in Ishmael. He has the male heir to his wealth, to his tribe, most importantly to God's covenant, the promise. Quite unexpectedly, God appears. He tells Abraham that Sarai is going to bear him a son, and that this son that God is going to use, this is the son that God's going to use to carry out the promises given to Abraham. The startled Abraham argues against this. He says, "God, please make it Ishmael that is blessed as his heir, not this unborn child." I mean, Abraham's astonishment and disappointment is easily understandable. First of all, Sarah is really old. And it simply can't be possible that she could conceive in that long dead womb of hers. But second, most important to Abraham, is that Ishmael is currently his much beloved, one and only son. All of his plans and hopes for the future rested in Ishmael. From the moment Hagar conceived, Abraham was overjoyed with the prospect of having a son. And that son was Ishmael. It is certain that Abraham told Ishmael, almost a teenager at the time, God threw a curveball at him, all about God. And that someday Ishmael would carry with him God's incredible blessing and plan for mankind. Suddenly, without warning, God changed all of Abraham's plans. Well, Abraham fell on his face. He begged God that Ishmael would be the heir to the covenant. God said, what? No. No. But in his great mercy, God told Abraham, don't worry about it. Ishmael's going to prosper. He's going to be a great man. He's going to bear 12 princes, that is, 12 tribal leaders. He's going to have countless descendants. That is exactly what happened. As the millions of members of the various Arab tribes we see today are the result of that. Nonetheless, it would be Isaac, God said. Isaac, the child to be born by Sarah. He would carry on with the promises of the covenant. Abraham was anything but happy with this new situation. This is not what he wanted. Yet obediently complied. It would be Isaac, his descendants, the Hebrews. They would carry on the promise given to Abraham. Well, despite his human failings, in Genesis 15:6, we see that Abraham believed Adonai, and Adonai credited it to him as righteousness. And while on the surface it's wonderful to see God's mercy, his grace in action, there is something a lot deeper in this passage to consider. God has just given mankind his formula for personal salvation. We are required to believe God, meaning to trust him, and then he will credit us with righteousness. Several hundred years before Moses received the Torah on Mount Sinai, 2,000 years before Yeshua was crucified, God revealed the only path to a right relationship with him. You must trust him. We find that some years after Hagar and Ishmael's desert ordeal, young Isaac had his own near-death experience. Out of the blue, God orders Abraham now to take Isaac, the son of promise, to an altar on a hilltop and sacrifice him. And by the way, let's drop this picture of some young innocent child being led out to sacrifice. Isaac was about 30 years old at this time. He knew what was happening. Though certainly devastating, it would not have seemed all that strange to Abraham, because human sacrifice to a god, that was pretty normal for that day. Particularly customary with the pagan tribes of Canaan. Abraham obeys. He takes Isaac to Mount Moriah, the place where the temple is going to be built some 900 years into the future. Look at these connections. Today, this place is called the Temple Mount. It's in the heart of Jerusalem. Moments before Abraham's going to plunge that flint blade into Isaac's chest, God stops him. He provides a ram, a male sheep, to be sacrificed in his stead. Another covenant follows. He promises to bring forth many more great nations, millions of descendants, and this relieved father and son go home. And Sarai, Isaac's mother, dies very shortly afterwards. A relieved father and son return home. She dies. Hebrew tradition says her death was the cause of all that stress of Isaac's near-death experience on the altar of sacrifice. Well, in the city of Hebron, Abraham buys land with a cave on it. He buries Sarah there. Abraham's now very old. He appoints a trusted servant to find a suitable wife for his son Yitzhak. Abraham despises the local Canaanite women. So he directs his servant to journey northward, back up to his ancestral home of Mesopotamia. There he's supposed to find an appropriate member of Abraham's extended family for Isaac to marry. And in the city of Nahor, the servant finds Rebekah, the daughter of Abraham's brother, Nahor. Now, though the place the servant went was named Nahor, it was not the namesake of Abraham's brother. This was a distant relative by the same name. Nahor was this brother who had elected to stay behind many years earlier rather than journey with Abraham onto Canaan. Well, about the time Rebekah arrives back in Canaan to marry Isaac, Abraham dies. about 175 years old. He's buried alongside his beloved Sarai. Abraham, revered by Jew, Christian, and Muslim, a man with character flaws, weaknesses, all the other human attributes that trip every one of us up. He loved and trusted God. God blessed him for it. And we're going to continue our bird's eye view of the formation of Israel as a preparation for the book of Joshua next week.